dear participants of today's meeting. First of all, I would like to pay special attention and express my deepest gratitude to the delegations from more than 10 countries who take part in today's meeting. Thus, it is fair to say that all attempts of certain states to sabotage this event are failed. For me, as a plenipotentiary of Donetsk People's Republic in Minsk negotiations, it is of a high honor and importance to give a report on the real situation in Donbass and at the Minsk talks. I would like to continue. I would like, first of all, to thank you for this opportunity, and I would like to continue my briefing in Russian in order to provide you with more precise and detailed information. The simultaneous translation is provided by the Russian mission to the UN Security Council, what we highly appreciate. Еще раз добрый день всем участникам. Хочу еще раз подчеркнуть важность и нашу благодарность за возможность донести нашу точку зрения на все события, которые сегодня происходят в Донбассе, и те события, которые происходят в переговорном процессе в Минске. Эта встреча действительно очень важна для нас, поскольку она дает нам возможность донести нашу точку зрения второй стороны конфликта Донецкой и Луганской народных республик. При этом хочу отметить, что все, что мы будем сегодня озвучивать, мы готовы подтвердить конкретными фактами и аргументами. Мы готовы ответить на любой вопрос. Хочу вкратце остановиться на истоках конфликта. Я думаю, все участники сегодняшней встречи в той или иной мере ознакомлены с тем, что происходило в Киеве в феврале 2014 года, но я думаю, не все знают, что же происходило в это время в Донецке и в Луганске. После переворота, который произошел в 2014 году, в феврале, естественно, люди в Донецкой области и в Луганской области были возмущены, были напуганы, могу сказать это откровенно. Но в тот момент, что удивительно и что интересно, никто не призывал отделяться от Украины или идти, например, на Киев войной. На самом деле в Донецке люди собирались на митинги и обращались к своим представителям местной власти, к депутатам Донецкого областного совета, чтобы они выступили как их, действительно, как их представители и защитили их права, то есть обратились непосредственно к представителям киевской новой власти с неким воззванием, с неким заявлением о том, каким образом хотят жить, на каком языке хотят говорить и какие права нуждаются в защите людей Донбасса. Но, тем не менее, украинские новые власти начали свой путь с таких шагов, которые еще больше напугали население Донбасса. То есть первый же законопроект...
The population of Donbass even more, the very first draft law that was voted by the Verkhovna Rada of Ukraine was the law that banned free usage of the Russian language. Besides, after the position was expressed about non-acceptance of what was going on in eastern regions of Ukraine, with the help of nationalist and radical elements of the society, the Ukrainian authorities started a blatant massacre and cleansing of all who disagreed. These are events in Odessa on 2nd of May, 3rd of May in Slaviansk, 9th of May in Mariupol. According to official statistics in Odessa, about 48 people died, at least 250 were injured. On 9th of May in Mariupol, more than 20 people were died. On the 3rd of May, during the storm of Slaviansk, more than 30 peaceful citizens died. All those events could not calm down the population of Donbass. On the contrary, they instilled fear and alarm. After that, the population was actually asked about how they saw their future, and the decision was made to hold a referendum. Another point, the local council the full local council, in fact, fled the Donetsk region, so people had no one to turn to proclaim this referendum and to convene it. There was the total lack of state power because there was no single legal representative from the point of view of Ukrainian authorities. Nevertheless, there was such referendum. The turnout is self-explanatory. It is about 75% of the population. Out of them, 90%, to be exact, 89.7% voted in favor of independence. This shows the degree to which people were not able to accept what was going on in Ukraine. I'd like to mention that Ukrainian Constitution is a direct action act, and its Article 38 says that people have a right to take part in state affairs during all Ukrainian and local referendums. However, Ukraine still has no law about local referendums and the order of their convening, which means that this direct action act of the constitution is in fact blocked by the effective legislation. However, the people of Donbass used this direct action act, Article 38 of the Ukrainian constitution. And the very same right is indicated in the UN Charter, as a matter of fact. In response to such actions, the Kyiv authorities waged a full-fledged war on the population of Donbass. The so-called anti-terrorist operation that was aimed against the population of Donbass has been in effect for 7 years by now. Later, it was renamed as Joint Forces Operation, but it doesn't change its matter. The military forces of Ukraine are used against the people of Donbass. Since then, no less than 13,000 people in Donbass died, out of them 149 children. Just think of it, those were children who could take no part in any armed action. They've just killed. 80% of those 13,000 people were the victims according to UN human rights, and those victims were on our side. Those are people who died from the shelling of Ukrainian armed forces. Against that background, we had nothing else to do but to protect ourselves, to protect our land, to protect the people of Donbass, and to respond to this undeclared yet effective war. We were at home, we had nowhere to go. We had to defend ourselves. So we responded in a way that Ukrainian armed forces were turned back in cauldrons under Ilovartseva, Izmailova, and Debaltseva. In that situation, we were not very willing to sign the Minsk agreements and the package of measures because we were in a strong position from the point of view of armed conflict. And people's support was very strong. However, thanks to the mediation institution, our leaders were convinced that continuation of conflict and of armed confrontation meant more victims. That is why we signed the package of measures. We agreed with the rules and principles enshrined in the Minsk agreements. And now I'd like to go over to the main topic of this meeting, namely implementation of the Minsk agreements and the implementation of final provisions of the Paris Normandy Summit last year in December. Since the Minsk agreements were agreed, it has been 6 years, but I must say that not a single provision of those documents has been implemented in full. Let me make a point about the provisions that provide a clear demonstration of what has not been implemented and why. Let us start with point 1 of the outcomes of the Paris summit, namely the immediate measures to stabilize the situation in conflict zones. This is the security bloc. Full and comprehensive implementation of ceasefire, as provided for in the first paragraph of this clause, was not completed and has not been completed yet. So what is the story of the attempt to implement this clause in the Minsk group? We, as plenipotentiary representatives of the second side of the conflict, starting from May 2018, 6 times sent our proposals, our drafts on full and comprehensive ceasefire. Those proposals contained concrete steps that were to be observed in order to maintain ceasefire, to maintain it by both sides of conflict, by armed formations on the both sides. However, Kiev gave us no official reply, no written reply at all. And in words, they simply refused to discuss or negotiate anything and just ignored our proposals. However, in 2019, in July, on the 17th of July, we negotiated the so-called indefinite truce. This truce contained those measures, those steps to preserve the ceasefire, but it was adopted in a declarative mode, orally. That is why Kiev did not feel compelled to observe those provisions. Since then, we have taken 3 more written attempts to put our obligations down in writing. And this contains an interesting moment that each side has to adopt a decree on the ceasefire and to make it public. We suggested signing this, but Ukraine refused on the pretext that such a decree would constitute a classified information, a state secret. We noticed such a peculiar feature of Ukrainian side. Any decisions negotiated by Ukraine are negotiated precisely at the point when eminent political events are happening in Ukraine. For example, election campaign, or the moment when President Zelensky needs a meeting in Normandy format. This was the case with agreeing on indefinite truce in July 2019, before parliamentary elections, and negotiating of Steinmeier formula before the meeting of Normandy format, and actually the signing of the measures that we have proposed for 2 years. This happened before the local elections, at the moment when there was a local election campaign. On the 22nd of July, we finally signed this document with additional measures. And in the first 2 months after the signing, it was really calm. There were no people killed or injured. No civil infrastructure was destroyed. So we can say that the ceasefire was effective for some time. However, local elections came to their end, and we started to observe the following events. One of the additional measures says that no side should make steps to advance the other side, which means that no new constructions must be engineered, no new trenches, no new dugouts. We pointed out that we see this activity on the Ukrainian side in Shumy settlement and in order to implement a joint inspection, which is a measure provided for in the document that we signed. To implement this measure, we proposed to the Ukrainian side to inspect this Shumy settlement in order to verify whether new trenches and new dugouts really had been constructed or not. However, the Ukrainian side toppled this joint inspection several hours before this inspection. It provided renewed demands for some documents that could not physically be met within the remaining hours before the planned inspection. And after that, the Ukrainian side refused to implement this clause at all. They said they did not understand the essence of this clause and the way it should be implemented. So this clause is not effective today, which actually makes all measures to preserve the ceasefire null and void, because without this clause, all those measures are purely declarative. They do not then have an opportunity to be verified whether there was any violation or not. It is not surprising for us that after those events, there were more and more violations. 157 violations have been made by now. There have occurred more victims among the civil population, a young man and his 69-year-old grandfather, who on the 12th of November were shell-shocked in Alexandrovka settlement. Also, our military servicemen are dying. I would not go deep into detail on that, but I would like to outline the methods that Ukrainian armed forces are using. They are somehow similar to methods that ISIL militants use. They drop grenades and explosive devices from UAVs. So they tie an explosive up to a drone and then drop it on our settlements or populated areas. A commander of our battalion died at the moment when he was trying to evacuate a dead body of his fellow soldier from the battlefield. He was killed by a sniper shot. So these are the methods that armed forces of Ukraine employ. So the measures that were taken to contain them are not working. Let me also make a point about the political aspect, which is no less important, probably even more important in terms of long-term settlement of the conflict. During the Paris summit, the sides agreed that in Minsk, the sides will have to negotiate and finalize all aspects of Donbass legal status. Unfortunately, we did not even get down to this. Let me give you an example that has to do with Steinmeier formula and its introduction to Ukrainian legislation. After, on the 10th of October 2016, the formula was adopted, and there were instructions and recommendations from the Normandy format to negotiate it at the Minsk platform. Right after that, this point was a priority issue at the agenda. However, during many dozens of meetings, during 67 meetings, the Ukrainian side blocked the discussion of this issue, which is for 2 years and 11 months, Ukraine was blocking this issue. And only on the 1st of October 2019, when there was a need for another summit, the Ukrainian side finally signed this document and negotiated, consolidated this formula that had already been agreed in the Normandy format. You can make sure of that by going to Verkhovna Rada website and looking through the legislation. Steinmeier formula has still not been implemented in the special status law. It is not there, despite the fact that it has been adopted 4 or 5 times already. So we do not see even attempts to have dialogue, to attempt a dialogue on the part of Ukraine, even though this dialogue is directly prescribed in the package of measures, the document that was endorsed by the UN Security Council. On the contrary, the Ukrainian side, by adopting decrees that run counter to the Minsk agreements and to the package of measures. Such decrees are about 60 in number. I could actually list them, but I think you have an opportunity to get yourself familiarized with them in the report that we hope the Russian mission will share with all the participants of this meeting. But I assure you that those decrees do not only run counter to the Minsk agreement, but they violate such rights as the right to life, to health and safe living conditions, right to liberty and security of person, right to freedom of movement, right to a fair trial, right to an effective remedy, right to the inviolability of home, right to private property, right to freedom of economic activity. Here I could basically list almost all political, basic, civil rights, cultural rights of people that are violated by those decrees. Let me make a special point about recent draft law of Ukraine, draft law on internment, a very interesting one, which, without any right to appeal, stipulates that the General Staff of Ukraine Armed Forces will take a decision about internment of citizens to some specified locations. The draft law presented by the Ukrainian side as a plan of action to implement the Minsk agreements by 78% contradicts those very Minsk agreements, because it totally rewrites the order of implementation of the agreements. Out of 51 paragraphs, 40 run counter to the package of measures. So the negotiations process remains blocked. I have outlined two areas, political and security areas, where not a single step was taken to make a decision.
On the contrary, we constantly hear from Zelensky and his team about Plan B, Plan C, some other ideas. And judging by the aggressive rhetoric of those statements, we're talking not about peaceful intentions of Kiev. Zelensky stated that on the 9th of December of 2020 is the end of the term during which the Ukraine supposedly follows the Minsk agreements, which means Ukraine right now is a step away from the official refusal of the peaceful plan approved by the UN Security Council. And in this regard, we have a question. Will there be a reaction, a response from you, dear members of the UN Security Council, to such official denial of Ukraine to implement the above-mentioned plan? Today, our meeting is about the results of our activity and our actions a year after Paris Summit. Ukraine has implemented none of the paragraphs of the agreed conclusions. So despite all our proposals of their implementation, the representatives of Kiev simply refuse to accept them, to work with them, to comment them in any sort or make any remarks. And with such refusal of the second party, the dialogue is impossible. It's just same as clapping with one hand. It's impossible to do. It's impossible to settle the conflict without dialogue. With all that said, the situation in the peaceful negotiation process is critical. We think that the Security Council has the right and all the necessary leverages to call Ukraine for responsibility and to answer for their action. We don't want escalation, although we know how to protect themselves. We want peace and prosperity for Donbass. We want for it to develop the social economic potential, for the rights to be observed, for the freedoms to be observed, for all our political and civil rights to be observed, taking account all the values that are stipulated in the international tool. Thank you for your attention.